You're listening to Coast Business Radio with Mike Ryan.
Professor Nikolai Petrovsky is Professor of Medicine at Flinders University and is set to become the first researcher in Australia to trial a COVID-19 vaccine in humans within weeks. He is also the founder of VAXINE, a company funded by the US National Institutes of Health to develop novel vaccine technologies. Professor, welcome.
Thank you.
What is a novel vaccine?
Well, at the moment, we don't have a proven vaccine against COVID-19. So arguably any successful vaccine that eventuates will be a novel vaccine of some form or other.
You and your company are leading the charge in Australia to develop the first COVID-19 vaccine, which is COVAX-19. Tell me, how have you managed this so quickly?
I think you need to appreciate it. A typical vaccine takes 15 years to develop. So the only way in which you can develop a vaccine faster than that is if you have most of the technology and components already sorted out so that you're ready to go from day one. So for the last 16 years, we've been funded by the United States National Institutes of Health to assemble essentially those components of a pandemic vaccine. The antigen platform of how we make the protein that is going to form the vaccine, and also what we call the adjuvant component, which is the turbocharger that we need to add to that protein to make the immune system recognize it. So we've done that multiple times in the past for particularly seasonal influenza and pandemic influenza, which obviously changes from year to year. So you need a robust platform to deal with those changes. And that means that we can essentially very rapidly develop a vaccine against any new pandemic. And so we were able to use that platform to develop COVAX-19, which, as you mentioned, is our vaccine candidate against COVID-19.
You're going to trial healthy people. Just tell me how this works and what further processes do you have to go through before you can actually manufacture it?
So the important thing to realise is that we don't in any way expose subjects in our clinical trials to any viruses, neither in the vaccine itself nor after they've had the vaccine. So essentially, in order to test the vaccine in humans, what we need to do is we give them the injection of the vaccine, which is a synthetic protein. And then we're able to measure the development of antibodies in their blood, which are markers of whether or not they would be protected if they were exposed to the COVID-19 virus. So it's really they get a few injections in their arm, and then a month after they've had the injections, we take just a simple blood test. And that will tell us whether the vaccine's working or not. So we don't need to expose them to the virus to know if the vaccine's working.
So how long will it then take to get this onto the market, and will the incredible level of investment be required quickly?
So time is everything in a pandemic, and I think, everyone's impatient to have a vaccine available, and obviously we're fully aware of that. So we're trying to do things as fast as humanly possible. But, there's some things that, you simply can't skip. And clearly we need to show in clinical trials that our vaccine is certainly safe and that it's likely to be effective. So that process will take generally 3 to 4 months. And we should have a result from the blood tests well before the end of this year. We then, will need to do even larger clinical trials. So, they may take anywhere from 3 to 4 months. And then once you have, data on at least several thousand people in the clinical trials, at that point you can seek approval of the vaccine to be given, more generally. So it's certainly not going to happen overnight, but by early next year, we would expect that our vaccine, if everything goes to plan, will be at the stage of that final approval stage. And of course, then the challenge is how to manufacture enough vaccine quickly. And that's a massive challenge that, it can't be underestimated. And while the clinical trials themselves are quite expensive, particularly as they get into the thousands of subjects, those trials can cost anywhere from $20 million to $400 million. That's the typical price to do those clinical trials. So that's not cheap. And obviously manufacturing and building a manufacturing facility to produce tens or hundreds of millions of doses of vaccines is similarly not a cheap exercise. So there does need to be considerable investment even once we have a successful vaccine to make that vaccine widely available.
Do we have any other places that could probably do this besides China, or are we going to have to stick with China?
So interestingly, China is one of the world's biggest drug producers, but it's actually a relatively small vaccine producer. If you look at volume of vaccines, then the biggest producer is India, followed by the United States and Europe, and then Japan. So in fact, China doesn't figure prominently in terms of global vaccine supply. They only produce vaccine for their own local market. They typically don't export it. So in this case, China is not really critical, I don't believe, to global vaccine supplies. As I say, places like India, Europe, and the United States are going to be more important.
China's not being very helpful in sharing information on the virus itself. How much has this sort of slowed the development of a vaccine?
Well, I would actually disagree. Certainly Chinese scientists have produced the vast majority of the papers that have been published on the virus to date, and have been making those papers available on pre-press servers, so you don't have to wait for them to come out in the formal publication. So I have to say I've found the data that they have shared to be extremely useful in both understanding the virus and also in preparing our own vaccine candidate. So I think certainly from a scientific perspective, as I say, China has contributed an enormous amount of data to the world for us to understand this virus.
See, there's still fake news out there.
I know they're being accused of maybe not sharing some of the very earliest experience from late last year when the virus was just starting. But, as I say, from January onwards, Chinese scientists like us, science is a competitive area. You want to get the scoop. And so Chinese scientists have been flooding, as I say, the scientific journals with papers on their research. So, and that I'm not aware in any way that's been, suppressed or not encouraged, because I guess China would like to be a world leader in science as well. And it wouldn't make sense for them to stop their scientists being able to publish their data.
Look, you've made some comments about the characteristics of this virus being very well adapted to humans. This being so, why did so many scientists dismiss the possibility that maybe the virus was from a lab?
So at the moment, we obviously, simply don't know where the virus came from. So there's no conclusive evidence of how did it happen. And that's not unusual early in a pandemic. It takes time to do the detective hunts, to trace down where the virus came from. And most commonly that would be from some wild animal population. But, there have been episodes where viruses and other pathogens have leaked out of laboratories in the past due to an accident. And we can't dismiss that possibility here. We're not saying that it's necessarily probable, but we're just saying it is one possibility that needs to be excluded. Now, as to some of my colleagues who jumped in very early with really no science to support their claims and said categorically this couldn't be a result of a laboratory leak, I can only presume that, they were speaking from, I guess perhaps more political perspective rather than a scientific perspective. And you would have to interview them to understand why they chose to make those statements, which I don't believe were founded on solid science.
Mm. How risky is this type of research being done by China on viruses? Are viruses of this type grown anywhere else in the world?
Yeah, so these viruses, which are what we call high pathogenicity viruses. So they include Ebola and Marburg, and the avian influenza strains that we hear about that cause human deaths, and a whole variety of exotic viruses that we know are highly lethal if animals or humans are exposed to them, are studied in facilities around the world. They're high security facilities that are designed for that specific purpose. Obviously, we have one right here in Geelong in Australia. And so, yes, I mean, these viruses are studied in most countries of the world. They're not restricted to China.
Back to COVAX-19. From now, the tests, the trials, I would imagine the licensing, the manufacturing, about how long we have to wait?
So the answer is I cannot see any vaccine being widely available before the end of this year. So I think we have to bar a miracle. It simply takes longer than that. By early next year, I expect to have vaccines, and we're obviously hoping ours is one of them, start to be made available. But of course, again, you can't make billions of doses overnight. You have to plan to manufacture it over, probably a number of years to get extensive coverage of everyone on the globe. So essentially, you have to then strategize and say, well, who gets the vaccine first? I'm confident we'll have a vaccine, and supplies will start to flow, next year. But of course, then we have to decide how do we, determine who should get it first. Should it be travellers? Because if you have to travel from Australia to even the United States right now, you'd want to be vaccinated. So you don't bring the virus back home when you return. And so, maybe we immunise people who are travelling first, particularly if they're travelling to high-risk places. Mm-hmm. It's the same as getting a yellow fever vaccine if you're going to South America. I mean, the average Australian doesn't get a yellow fever vaccine because, Australia doesn't have yellow fever. So it may well be if we have no COVID-19 in Australia, we only need to immunise the people who are planning to travel outside of Australia. Obviously, if the people who are at the front line, so the doctors and nurses, even if we don't have many cases in Australia, they are at the highest risk of coming into contact with a case. And so you would obviously seek to immunise them early on. And then finally, if there still is COVID-19 around in the community, then we know that it's highly lethal for people who are elderly. The mortality rates in people over 80 is somewhere around 25%, so 1 in 4 will die from it. So obviously they should be the people we should be protecting with our vaccine next. So in terms of you, I gather you're not over 80 and you're not working in a hospital. Maybe you are planning to travel, but obviously that would determine when you're likely to get a vaccine, and that may be still a year and a half or even 2 years away.
My travel is to a supermarket, so I'm not going anywhere. But look, I have to ask you this. The media, I truly think the media has been appalling in the reporting of this. It's looking for that clickbait. Have we been caught up in the hype of the sensationalism or the over-reporting or the dramatic reporting from the media. I mean, you're a scientist. You see it as it is. So what do you think?
Yeah, so look, from day one, I was just following the statistics, and the statistics, haven't lied and have stayed consistent even from when China reported, this back in early January. They were looking at between 1% and 3% mortality rates, and that's held true to this day. The reason we've had so few deaths in Australia is that we've taken a lot of actions to control the virus, so there's very little virus. If we were to take the opposite approach and just say, well, let the virus spread through the community, then, you only have to multiply the population of Australia at 25 million by, between, 1% and 3%, and that will tell you how many deaths we can expect. That's an awful lot of deaths. That's somewhere between 100 and 300,000 people. So the reason we have such a low death rate is we've taken appropriate action. And similarly for other countries that have taken it seriously and have, done everything in their power to stop the spread of the virus. If we look at countries which haven't taken that approach, and I guess, the leading examples are the United States, Italy, United Kingdom, who initially, were very complacent and had bought this story that this was no worse than a case of the flu. And you look at the mortality rates in those countries, and they're very big numbers, 100,000 plus in the United States, over 30,000 deaths in the United Kingdom and Italy. And, they're still only a small way into this pandemic. Don't think that's the death rate's just going to stop there. If you let this virus keep circulating in your community, the death toll is just going to keep rising. And, on our projections, you'd be looking at millions of deaths in the United States, hundreds of thousands of deaths in places like UK and Italy. So, and similarly Australia. So, yeah, the problem was back in January, people said, oh, well, no one's died of this, so the flu's much worse, which makes no sense because the flu obviously circulated the whole year. And at that point, the virus, COVID-19, had only been circulating in some places for less than a week. And of course, the death rate's low. But you have to base it on the statistics, as I say, that were already available from China telling us what the real mortality rate was. And as I say, that hasn't changed if you look at the numbers today. So that, the part of the press that was trying to say this was no worse than a case of flu, I think caused terrible damage. And you could argue they are responsible for already hundreds of thousands of deaths in those countries that really listened to that press story.
And then we could also talk about the economic impact. It's a tricky one there because, we could say we need to open the economy, but if we all get sick, we're not going to open the economy because there's not much left. And if we don't open the economy, there's not much left. So it's a really tricky situation. I'm going to place my bet on you because we need you to work really, really hard, and you can send me the first vaccine.
Absolutely. Look, and I guess that's what we've been saying since January is the only way the world has out of this is with a successful vaccine. There never was going to be any other solution to resolve both the health problems, but as you say, the economic problems. And just really the big surprise is how little investment there has been in vaccines so far. When we're talking $15 trillion of economic damage to date, and the investment in vaccines is 0.01% of that economic, damage. There should be a lot more investment in vaccines, I think, all around the world, and because a vaccine is the only way out.